If we're recording, I think we'll get started. I'd like to call the November 10th meeting of the Oxford Planning Commission to order. And please ask Mr. Perry to call the roll.
Ms. Rosenberg?
Here.
Mr. Bracken?
Here.
Mr. Watt?
Here.
Mr. Keebler?
Yes.
Ms. Blackmore?
Here.
Mr. Dana?
Here, yes.
Mr. Snavely?
I'm here. All right. First item is approval of the agenda. I'd receive a motion, please, to.
I so move. Steve Dana moves.
Moved by Steve, seconded by
Corey
Corey.
or Carla. We both kind of tied.
Yeah, well, you're vice chair. You should do that. All those in favor of approving the agenda, just raise your hand for the screen. Okay. Everyone having approved, we will move on to the minutes of September 8th.
Move to approve.
Thank you, Shauna.
I second.
Seconded by Steve. Are there any additions, corrections, or modifications that anyone has noticed? Hearing none, all those in favor of approving the minutes, please raise your hand again.
I have to abstain. I wasn't at the meeting.
Thank you. That is a legitimate abstention.
Actually, they all are, but
Well, according to our law director, you can't abstain the way you have in the past. Anyway,
we'll talk later, Bill.
all right. We'll move to public comments related to items not on the agenda. Sam, are there any members of the public who would like to address the Planning Commission?
There are none in the queue currently. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll move then to reports from commissions, boards, committees, and staff. Shauna, you want to start us off? Do you have any reports?
Sure. So the Housing Advisory Commission, in our last meeting, we decided to figure out our goals for 2021 and just kind of reflect on how we did in the goals in 2020. So really after the next meeting, the one that's coming up next week, I'll probably be able to report on what those goals will be.
Super. Jason?
Yeah, we're looking at a couple things in the Environmental Commission, looking at potentially cooperative solar. We're looking at the possible benefits of flaring off landfill gas, and we're talking a lot with PSP members at the university about working together for keeping track of our climate footprint.
Excellent. Thank you. Who would like to go next? Corey? You
I
got-
will
Okay,
go
go ahead, Steve.
Well, I'd just like my colleagues to know and to recognize the Coalition for Healthy Communities, which is run out of Talawanda Schools under the leadership of Amy Masechko. There is a leadership team, and the goal of this group, and I met just last week, and we affirmed this, is to eradicate health inequities to bring more equitability to the citizens of Greater Oxford. And so we seek to embrace diversity in that attempt. And it's a vital group. It's a very vital group. And I tip my hat to Amy Masechko, who is a marvelous leader.
Thank you, Steve. Corey, how's HAPC doing?
Well, we don't meet tomorrow, so we have a bit of a reprieve there. But when we met in October, there's a couple things I want to update the commission on, and I'm not going to go in any particular business order. Sam and staff had brought the concept of the small cell phone poles. So instead of the giant ones that we're used to seeing on the freeway, there's smaller models that are used to really bridge the gap between the larger ones. There's no current ordinance in Oxford, and it's kind of a mix of the rights of utilities, the rights of historic. So Sam and Zach and those folks are working on really kind of getting our, well, actually beyond HAPC, really trying to identify ways for us to get ahead of the curve, work with, possible scenarios that might come up, and make sure we've thought about them before we have one of these, hey, we don't want you to put that there. Well, that's nice, but you didn't say anything. And this is really just for the historic areas. This wouldn't count for like Locust or places that aren't currently in one of the 3 historic districts. There were some modifications to the proposal at Brick Street. Very small. The general concept of adding the sky deck or party deck, I forget which it's called, is still intact. We did, even though not in our purview, kind of perk up and realize that the upper deck was not handicap accessible. And I have to give kudos to Sam. He very quickly, after the meeting, reached out to some folks to get some clarification, and everything's fine as far as compliance and liability, if you will, on the city's part. It's just an opportunity for, I guess it'd be state building code to improve and be a little more inclusive. But as far as Oxford's concerned, that is, even though it may not be what some people aesthetically want, it will be compliant. And I do have to give credit to the owners. A few of us threw aesthetic requests that are not required by code, ordinance, or anything, and they were very open to them. So I think people will be pleased with the modifications. The one that breaks my heart that I have to report to you guys is 101 West Church Street, affectionately known as Dying to Get In, the old funeral home. This is a multi-month, very complex, fun and exciting sequence of votes, decisions, a lot of analysis. There was quite a lot of discussion on the 2 big buckets, if you will, were whether or not to permit demolition of the current structure. And then once that passed, I don't recall the count, but I want to say it was 5-2. It was pretty close. Do you guys remember? Yeah, irrelevant. It barely passed. But at the last meeting on a 5-4 vote, the approval for the proposed new building did pass. There was a lot of discussion, a lot of concern about the cohesiveness with surrounding areas. Sam and Ben and everybody and Chris did a great job trying to kind of walk us through the minutia. So I want to give them credit on that. But sad to say, it's a fabulous building. It's a great building design. But I openly said, I just don't think that's the right spot for it. Norm Butt has a very nice looking building, but it was somewhat the consensus that it didn't belong at that corner. So just wanted to let you know that that was a well thought discussion. And I don't know the timeline. Sam and his team will obviously go through the procedures with building permits and demolition. So like I said, kind of a heartbreaker for the history buffs, but hopefully it'll all work out well.
Thanks, Corey. Does anyone else have a report? Yes, Carla.
Hi, we had our Oxford Parking and Transportation Advisory Board meeting on Monday, and we did see the early results of a parking study that was done by Oxford PD this year to kind of assess what strategies will be best for updating the technology for our meters from the old coin collection meters to meters that have more options for easy updates and adjustment depending on different types of events or times of year. And so it was interesting. I think the challenge that we have is that this year has been so unusual in terms of the parking uptown, and it makes for some sort of strange data. And so I think that the big takeaway from that was that there's going to be an effort made to kind of look into some of the historic data, which unfortunately is a little bit, it's not exactly like apples to apples, pears to pears with the data that was collected this year. So there's some data collection issues. However, long story short, coming to you at some point soon will be, especially to council specifically, will be the results of this parking study and some preliminary discussion of what types of technology make the most sense as we look to update the uptown meters. So that was the main takeaway from our our Parking and Transportation Advisory Board.
Carla, has there been any discussion about the parking garage and ways to encourage people to actually use it?
So I think that, I think you'll see the results of the study, but one thing that does seem to be true is that a lot of times right now, people who work uptown are not using the garage necessarily. And so there's a variety of things that can be done to incentivize that with regard to pricing. And I think that you'll see going forward, as parking becomes more constrained, more of an effort to use pricing to encourage people who are going to spend like an 8-hour day or 8-hour duration or a longer day to use the parking garage as opposed to some of the other options.
Yeah, and I think that's a really key point. And a lot of times there's no parking on the streets, but the parking garage is barely used at all for public parking. And I think part of that is that the cost is higher and it runs all day long. And in my opinion, and Jason and I will probably have to deal with this at some point on council, but I think we need to talk about how to make the garage an attractive option so that people will actually use it. And I think if it went along more with the parking structure on the street, on Main Street, it might well be used. So, anyone else? Yes, Sam.
Just a quick follow-up to Corey's comments about HAPC. One of the conditions was a historical marker to document the cultural history there. That's important to Oxford. So that's one positive thing that came out of that. I also want to say that we're going to be presenting some options to council Tuesday night at 6:30 for the work session on comp plan updates. So welcome to tune into that if you'd like to see what the council's reaction is to some options that we want to present for comp plan updates in the coming months and years. So that's all I have. Thanks.
Okay. Not hearing any others. One item is that next meeting, we should have a brief executive session. We need to talk about roles and assignments. It's the annual meeting to do that. So council will have already determined who are their council representatives. And so you should be thinking about it. If anybody wants a switch or a change, we'll take it up at that meeting. I think, Sam, we should only need 15 minutes. I can't imagine that we would need more than that. Okay, there's no other reports. Looking around, I don't see any. We'll move to new business, which is a staff presentation on potential zoning code text amendments. We're going to look at the parking code and the district and supplemental provisions. And I think Zach is going to take the lead on that.
Yes, I will, Mr. Chair. Let me go ahead and bring my screen up for everyone. Just a second here. Okay. And then just let me know if you cannot see my screen for some reason. Just holler at me. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and get started here. So there's essentially two packages of amendments that staff has initiated that'll actually be up for formal vote opportunity in December. But just like we did with the last text amendment package, we'd like to bring it to the commission early just to get your feedback and see if there's any changes that we might want to make before we end up at that December meeting. So there will be no formal vote that will need to be taken tonight. But we certainly welcome any comments or feedback that you wish to give. As I said, there's two different packages. The first package of amendments, we're referring to that as the parking code update. So that predominantly affects chapter 1149 in the zoning code, which is our parking standards chapter. And it also has a few amendments that touch the conditional use chapter as well. So I will go through that for everyone. And if you wish to follow along, I'm going to be going by topic. So if you'd like to in your packet, if you want to refer to page 4, that's the beginning of the memorandum that addresses the parking code updates. So I'll just go through each topic one by one as they're listed in the table there in the memo. But just to give you some quick details ahead of time. So the city is initiating these amendments. We did vet these through Bill before initiating them. So they are up for, at least for discussion for tonight, but then formal vote in December. I mentioned the 2 chapters that the parking code update is affecting. That's 1147 and 1149. And then here's a list of topics that we're going to be touching on. So going to the first topic. And I realized I wanted to say something. I totally forgot to say it. So generally with these text amendment packages that we're moving forward, a lot of what we are proposing is basically cleanup. It's a lot of housekeeping. It's a lot of issues that arose just through my experience here, getting used to the zoning code, getting used to a new community. I've been here for going on about 2 years now. So a lot of these issues just arose from questions that I had that I directed to Sam, because he's been here for much longer, as you know. Various inconsistencies and things that need to be fixed within the code. So we're trying to fix a lot of those things with these text amendment packages. So that's kind of just a general overview for the reason why we're moving these forward at the moment. But just to begin with our first topic in the parking code update, and if you would like me to, Mr. Chair, if you want me to go topic by topic and then give like a Q&A after each topic, or if you would prefer I go through everything first and then do just a general Q&A at the end, do you have a preference as to how I approach this?
I think my preference would be to go ahead and ask if there's questions or comments after each section. Okay, perfect. That's what I'll do then. So the first topic is applicability. So we have a line in our parking code. It all comes down to one line that determines when the actual parking regulations apply. And that line is that it's any new development, redevelopment, or change to a, let me move my window here, change to a use or structure or site. That can be very vague and present some challenges, especially when it comes to what constitutes a redevelopment or a change to a structure or site. We've had difficulty in the past trying to apply this particular standard. I think what is clear is that certainly if you are expanding your use within an existing structure, or if you're expanding the structure, then the parking codes apply. But there are other instances where there are sort of interior modifications going on that don't necessarily increase the intensity of the use. And so then it becomes a lot murkier in terms of, when do we actually apply the parking standards? So we propose actually to just strike this line entirely and just beef up this section, this applicability section. So that way it's more clear in terms of when the parking standards are being applied, when there's changes to a site, whether it be a brand new development or an expansion of some kind or a change of use. So just to go through these here. So clearly whenever there is a new land use being established, the parking standards would apply. So that is stated in the new text. If you're changing your land use, then you would need to comply with the new parking regulations per that use. For any expansions, we're setting that at a 25% threshold. So if you go greater than 25%, then the entire site as a whole would need to come into compliance. But if it's less than 25% or exactly 25%, then you would only provide parking based on the expansion alone. So only considering the actual either expansion of the use or expansion of the structure as the basis for the additional parking spaces. And then with existing uses, oftentimes we see
cases where the building or the use itself is not really changing, but the parking is. So the parking is being made more compliant. So rather than saying, you know, if there's going to be any change whatsoever to parking, that it's got to fully comply, we're basically saying you can make it more conforming. Like if you have a deficient amount of spaces per the existing use and you want to add more spaces, but it maybe doesn't get you quite up to the point where you're in full compliance with the minimum, that's fine, because you're taking what is ultimately something that's non-conforming and you're making it more conforming. And then finally stating that any existing parking could not be reduced to the point where it's being reduced below a minimum requirement. So that's the first topic in a nutshell, and I'm happy to take any questions on that topic.
I guess I just had one that I think my colleagues have already thought through, but I'll ask it anyway. And that has to do with expanded uses and the choice of the 25% figure that was based on that. I'm curious as to how that came about, that particular percentage.
That's a great question. So that figure is one that's common in other zoning codes. And it's also in our existing code in the nonconformities chapter, when it talks about when you've got a non-conforming use, you can expand it up to 25%. So it seems to be already sort of a pre-established rule of thumb that's sort of a, maybe has sort of a magical quality about it, that it, for whatever reason or another, a lot of, you know, zoning practitioners have agreed that that's kind of a reasonable threshold that kind of keeps you without going, you know, too substantial in the expansion. You allow for a little flexibility without having to fully comply with the code. But then past that threshold, then the expectation is that there be more of a substantial improvement done to the site and more of an effort made to actually bring it up to code.
Well, thank you. That's helpful.
Anybody else? Okay.
All right. So going to the next topic, pre-existing gravel parking. This is a fun one. So as I'm sure many of you know, we have a lot of what we deem grandfathered gravel parking areas, especially within the mile square. And those are non-conforming with respect to the material. And they're also oftentimes non-conforming with respect to setbacks. So the issue at hand here is the paving over of these pre-existing gravel areas, which oftentimes straddle property lines. So this particular example, this is 111 East Spring. This was a recent project where it was a conversion from a fraternity to a 3-family dwelling. And because they were changing the use, they had to comply with the new parking regulations. Well, of course, they had all this gravel and it straddled this property line between 2 different property owners. And all the standards of the parking code kick in, which are inclusive of not only paving over any gravel areas, but also adhering to a 2-foot setback requirement. Well, it's hard to meet that requirement when your parking already straddles that property boundary. So our sort of administrative approach to this already has been to say, well, if you can record a cross-access easement between the owners and present that as evidence to the city that there's sort of this ability to cross over both of those properties unimpeded, then we won't require you to go to the BZA for a variance to that 2-foot setback standard. So what this is doing is essentially taking sort of the staff's, you know, best practice approach to this issue of, you know, allowing for an easement to satisfy a code, or at least the spirit of one, and actually codifying it, putting it into the code to say this is an acceptable way to deal with these pre-existing gravel areas. Obviously, if this gravel area didn't exist before, we wouldn't allow for that pavement to actually traverse over that property line and not comply with the setback. But for these pre-existing situations, ideally, we want to, you know, encourage the, you know, excavation and removal of that gravel and replacing it with a hard surface material, either concrete or asphalt or something to that effect. So that is what this new topic and this new amendment is all about. Any questions on this one?
Carla, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just had a policy goal question, which is, is there an advantage to gravel in the sense that it's more permeable in this area than concrete?
I can take that one.
Go ahead, Sam.
Thanks. So actually, a previous employer that I worked for did a study on this, the engineer that I worked with. And what they found was over time, the type of gravel that is used for parking areas, after a few years, the dust just essentially turns into pavement and it's not really permeable. Other gravel that's used for landscaping does have permeability, but the type of gravel that's typically used for parking does not. So while in theory it would be desirable and make sense, it's not actually happening in practicality. So since the goal of the code is to create a dustless, safe, and clean parking area, that seems to prevail in this situation.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Sure.
Okay, anybody else? Seeing none, carry on.
All right, moving on. The dimensional standards, I won't touch on this for very long. This is mostly just cleanup and clarification. So presently, all of our dimensional standards for aisles and parking space widths and lengths and so forth, that's all provided in a table, and it's all lumped into this general section. And there's like one line in there that talks about everything in the table applying to non-residential uses. And the way that we've interpreted that in the past is that that means non-residential and multifamily. And we're basically using another line of the code elsewhere in the chapter to kind of make that call that all of these dimensional standards apply to those specific uses. So we're kind of cleaning up that applicability to make sure that it's clear when that particular table applies. So there's tables 1149, 04-1 and 04-2. Those are new. It's following a new naming convention. That way it's clear that those tables sort of fall under a given section rather than being as a standalone section unto itself. So we think this will help kind of clear everything up. And again, there's not really any policy changes here. It's just kind of reinforcing the current practice of our office. Any questions?
Keep going.
All right. Required parking spaces. So we'd like to split this off into a separate section as well. And again, using the new naming convention for the table. There is a policy change here that I'd like to explain. And it's quite small. You might have missed it in the actual text. But if you notice under 3 family, we're crossing out the 0.5 part of the 2.5. So we want to take that from 2.5 to 2 as the minimum number of required spaces per dwelling unit. So basically what that translates into is single family would be a minimum of 2 as it has been. 2 family would be a minimum of 4 spaces and 3 family would be a minimum of 6. Presently 3 family, it bumps it up to a minimum of 8 because you do 2.5 times 3 and then you round it up to the next number, which is 8. So in our mind, it doesn't really make sense to do it that way. We would rather just do it 2, 4, 6 in that manner for 1, 2, and 3 family. And then finally, we'd like to add a section dealing with unlisted uses at the end of our table. Our table isn't completely exhaustive when it comes to all of the land uses that may result in a new development. I don't think any zoning code really is. You can't always anticipate everything that might occur. So what we'd like to have is to provide a section that gives a little bit of guidance to the zoning administrator to determine what the minimum number of parking spaces should be when the particular land use that is being developed is not listed in the table. And for that, we are referring to either the Institute of Transportation Engineers tables, which we just recently purchased a copy of, those studies and readings for the number of parking spaces by land use, or to refer to a parking plan review process, which I'll get into a little bit later. But are there any questions on what's happening with the table there as far as the dwelling unit change?
I think that makes a lot more sense, and I like the numbering, makes it a lot clearer, the tables.
Great. All right. Moving on to residential regulations. So again, applicability, we're kind of clearing that up, making sure that it's interpreted this section only applies to single family, 2-family, and 3-family. Another thing that we would like to do is adjust the minimum driveway setback standard, bump it up by a foot, go from 2 feet to 3 feet. And that matches other setback standards of our code. So the odd thing is if you have a driveway and if part of that driveway is being used as a required parking space, that's what is called by our code as an unenclosed parking space, one that's not within a garage, it has to be 3 feet away from the side lot line. But then magically, if it's not going to be used for a parking space, it's going to be 2 feet. So we would rather just keep it consistent throughout, no matter if the pavement is being used for parking or not for parking, just have everything set at 3 feet. And this also matches the setback standard from principal structures, which is 3 feet as well. So that way, when somebody calls me up and says, hey, where can I put this pavement for this, driveway and so forth, this parking area, I can say, keep it 3 feet away from the structure and 3 feet away from all the lot lines and you're good. So it's a lot simpler of an answer rather than going into a more complicated approach based on parking spaces. There's another clarifying element in here where we are saying that the driveway width, the maximum of 18 feet, that applies to driveways off of streets only, not from alleys. And this is consistent with current practice because whenever somebody is doing a new project, a new single family, for instance, in the mile square, and they're doing parking off of the alley, well, actually, let's not do single family, let's do 2-family. So that would be 4 parking spaces. We're allowing them to sort of stack them up horizontally off of the alley. So that's a width that's much wider than the 18 feet. In fact, it's double the 18 feet. And we allow that without a variance. So again, it's just sort of clarifying that this is an acceptable practice. It's an acceptable standard that we're already following. We also have a new standard in here that I think is going to really help us in the future. And that is to require all of our parking areas for single, 2, and 3-family to be designed in a maneuverable manner so that when vehicles are driving through these parking areas, they're not driving through non-paved areas and leaving, ruts in the grass and causing, muddy, messy areas. And this will help provide us better guidance and give us kind of some teeth to rely on in these particular cases, because a lot of the plans and examples that we're seeing now, they're really starting to take it down to almost bare bones as far as being able to get vehicles back in to new parking spaces. So rather than rigidly follow the dimensional standards tables, which again are only going to apply to multifamily and non-residential, commercial and industrial, we would rather just reference those tables for guidance, but just have this more subjective standard about maneuverability. So that way you don't always necessarily need a variance, but if it gets to that, sort of bare bones minimum and it doesn't really pass the smell test with staff, then we can kind of hang our hat on this standard and say, we don't believe it meets this maneuverability standard. So you either got to show us how it meets it, or you got to come forward for a variance. So that summarizes the residential section. Any questions on this one?
I see none.
Yes,
Okay.
I do have one.
Richard, go.
Okay.
It's more of an organizational thing. On page 38, under 1149.06B, I don't think it's a good idea to start out the regulations by telling people how to get out of them. And so you start out telling them that the city engineer can vary these regulations, and then you tell what the regulations are. I would make that a paragraph 8 and put it down at the bottom.
Okay, so you're talking about current section B, access and maneuvering.
Access and
New
maneuvering.
section C, I'm sorry. On page 38, access and maneuvering.
Current B, future C.
Right. The city engineer may vary these regulations, and then you list the regulations. Like I say, it doesn't sit right with me that you start off telling how to avoid the regulations.
Yeah, I think we can fix that pretty easily. The history on that is this was intended to, that sort of exemption or variance was intended for access management because there really isn't an access management policy as far as the curb cut locations and spacing.
Right.
I think you're right that we should move this out of that section completely because that's really private property, which is not really something the city engineer has a lot of direct oversight on. So
Okay.
I like the idea of not allowing the city engineer to get,
Well, I'm going to bring the same thing up on page 40 on non-residential regulations because the same paragraph's there. And it's just like I said, you're starting off a regulation by telling people how to get out of it. And by simply moving it down to the last item, I think that just takes care of it. Set your standard and then tell people how to get out of it, not the other way around.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah, that's an easy fix. We can find a better place for it.
Thank you, Richard. Anybody else? Okay, Zach.
All right. Moving along, non-residential. So we've got an applicability section for this one, clarifying it's non-residential, multifamily, inclusive of mixed-use sites. And there's a little bit of a cleanup happening with the section that talks about not allowing for vehicles being displayed for sale. I felt that needed just a little bit of extra explanation that when it's talking about vehicles for sale, that is only allowed when it's a legally permitted principal use for vehicle sales. So it's got to be a legal car lot, basically, is the only place where that is an acceptable practice.
So not TJ Maxx.
Correct.
Thank you.
I think that's all with this one. That was very light for this section, but just as Mr. Keebler had pointed out, we'll make sure and move that city engineer section toward the bottom of that access and maneuvering subsection for non-residential.
Thank you.
Okay. Sidewalks and walkways. This is new stuff, some new exciting stuff. So presently, we actually don't have any requirements for public sidewalks for single site development. The only time that sidewalks become a requirement in our code is through the subdivision process when a developer is going in and constructing new streets. But when you've got a vacant site that sits along an existing roadway that is being developed in a private manner where there's essentially no new public infrastructure being created, there's no new streets being created, we don't have anything in our code to really rely upon to say that you need to construct a public sidewalk, especially in cases where there may not be one existing. So what I did is I wrote up some standards. I shared them with the city engineer. These standards do meet his approval. He's pretty excited about them as well. So what these specify then is that a public sidewalk would be required to be constructed where there is none. And we specify a minimum width of 5 feet for the sidewalk. If there is a case where there's a site and there's an existing sidewalk, if it just so happens that there are segments in disrepair, this section would require for those to be replaced. And we also allow for substitution of a bike path where it is deemed appropriate per the plans that the city has, where a bike path may be installed in lieu of the required sidewalk. We also have a section for a walkway from the public sidewalk to the private development to ensure that it is linked to the the public's area. So, and that would have to be a minimum width of 5 feet as well, and connecting to the private development's public entrance.
Zach, this is Corey. I have a quick question.
Yes.
So this is only for new construction?
This would be for any project that's applicable to where the parking standards become applicable. So kind of going back to the first applicability section, which presently reads any development, redevelopment, or change of use.
Okay.
So if you meet those certain thresholds, so basically if it's over 25% expansion, if it's a change of use, or if it's a new use, then yes, that's when it applies.
Okay, no, thanks for the clarification. As I read that, I just saw, I guess, seeing the word new so many times, I just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
No problem. Good question. Any other questions on this one?
Is there any kind of,
Go ahead, Carla.
sorry, I just wanted to say I think this is great, and I wanted to also ask. I noticed there's a section on kind of parking lot circulation and safe access for pedestrians in the code, and I was wondering if there was a possibility. You know, could that also be triggered by this type of improvement? So we've got a couple of large scale parking lots in town that just have real pedestrian access issues. And I kind of wonder if there's opportunities for improvement there when changes are.
Yeah, so the way I see this section is working very much in tandem with the existing language that we have that addresses for separate parking, separation between parking and pedestrian access ways, which is already within our code and is very well written, I might add, as it already exists in our code. But unfortunately, it just doesn't go quite far enough to explicitly say that a walkway shall be required and a sidewalk shall be required. So I see, these new standards working very well with the existing standards that apply to, the non-residential multifamily parking areas to make sure that when these new walkways constructed, that they're going to be, of a different pavement material so that is easily and more clearly discernible from, what is typically, the asphalt sort of parking spaces, parking aisles of the site.
Carla,
I agree with
Carla, so we'll take another look at it.
With respect to the bicycle path. I mean, I think that's really creative. That serves a larger purpose, and substitution of a bike path is appropriate. I'm just thinking, to me, that's really sound and imaginative planning.
Just a housekeeping matter. I think in order to make the Zoom meetings work, if you would just kind of raise your hand when you want to contribute,
Right.
That'll allow me to call on somebody, and then we don't have three people talking at once, and then you lose everything. So if you would do that, I would appreciate it. I've got the grid on so I can see everybody. Thanks. Would anybody else have a question or comment on sidewalks and walkways? Seeing none, go ahead, Zach.
Okay. Parking plan review is the next topic. So if you recall earlier this year, we went through and reviewed the tree ordinance, which was adopted by council. And in that set of amendments, we had a process provided for landscape plan review. And that was basically sort of a safety valve to where if an applicant was having difficulty complying with the expressed standards of the code, then they could basically bring it forward to the Planning Commission, propose an alternate plan, and basically work it out on more of a discretionary basis with the Planning Commission. And then ultimately the Planning Commission would vote on it, and that would be basically it. The buck would stop with the Planning Commission. So kind of the idea that I had in mind going through the parking code updates was, if we can do it for trees, why not do it for parking as well? So we have a section in here drafted that is basically relying upon the structure that was created for that landscape plan review process and providing for a parking plan review that would allow for some variation from the strict requirements of the parking code and allow for more of a discretionary approach to compliance. But some of the key differences here between parking plan review and landscape plan review would be it wouldn't apply to single, 2, and 3 family projects. So we wouldn't really be getting into micromanaging, small parking areas for smaller residential uses.
Yeah.
There's a parking demand study that's highly encouraged by the language. So basically, instead of the code sort of giving a prescriptive requirement on this is the number of parking spaces that you need, the applicant can kind of make their case for, well, this is actually the true need for, number of parking spaces that we actually want to have or feel that we need to have based on our proposal. And there's also different review criteria that the Planning Commission would consider in making a determination. What this would also effectively accomplish, and this actually, I'm going to turn to the next topic here because it very much relates to the conversation about parking plan review. So presently we have conditional uses for off-site parking where somebody is fulfilling their parking requirements on a separate property that is accessible somehow, through public walkways, sidewalks, or crosswalks to get in between, particular use that's being developed and an off-site parking area. That's off-site parking. Shared use parking is where you've got a single site but multiple uses, and you have less amount of parking than what the minimum of the code would be. But because of the nature of the different land uses and the different times of day, or maybe even days of the week where those parking spaces are going to be utilized, they can kind of operate in a harmonious manner to where you're not going to come up short on the number of spaces that you might need at a given time. That's shared parking. So we have conditional uses already specified in the code for these two different parking alternatives. And then we also have a process called parking lot alternate design plans. And for some of you who maybe been around for a lot longer than I have, of course, you may know or recognize that particular term because these used to get reviewed quite frequently. I believe it was maybe in the early 2000s. I'm not sure quite when the time period was where those kind of stopped being the case or stopped happening. But these used to be quite common, and it was a way to sort of fulfill your code compliance by, going through the conditional use process, but just for the parking element alone. So what we propose to do is actually just strike all three of these conditional uses, make them not conditional uses anymore, because it's really not a use, it's an element to the way in which a site is designed and developed. But give the Planning Commission the ability to review these elements and in a manner similar to the landscape plan review process that we've already put into the code. And then the last thing to mention about the conditional use chapter, we have a very odd section at the end of the chapter, and it's titled Transition Parking Lots Serving Commercial Uses Within Residentially Zoned Area. This is not a section that we really utilize, or I can't think of an instance where we have activated, at least in my tenure here. So it's hard, finding sort of the documentation in the city files about, maybe what the rationale was behind this or what it was specifically referring to. So because we're not really utilizing it, because it doesn't seem to fulfill a purpose, and please, if any of you know what this is talking about, please feel free to tell us. We are absolutely curious about what this is all about. But in the absence of having any real explanation, our proposal is just to strike it completely from the code. And what I think it might be addressing, and what might be a good thing to have in the code as sort of a replacement of maybe what the spirit of what this was all about in the first place, was to have a new section that addresses new or substantially expanded parking within uptown zone, within the uptown business area, or the surrounding residential office zone, which is sort of that transition district that surrounds the uptown business district. Think Church Street and Walnut Street. Having that be an actual conditional use at that point, where the parking is looked at more on a use standpoint, and that would become more protective of the urban fabric that's been established within the core of the city, and not depleting that fabric or allowing that fabric to be taken away more easily. so that if somebody wants to have a surface parking lot within those areas, then you actually have a more rigorous review. And at that point, then the Planning Commission and Council would get involved because it would be following the conditional use process. So I think that would be a suitable alternative, or maybe replacement, if you will, to what this section may have been trying to get at in talking about transition parking lots.
My history goes back to 1987, and I have no idea what that was, when that came in or why. Yes, Richard.
114908 parking plan review starting on page 46. I believe that entire section is quite confusing.
Which one?
Parking plan review starting on page 46. It's not clear when a parking plan review is required and when it's not. It's not clear if it's, when you say cases involving discretionary approval, I think it should be for cases requiring administrative approval, or for cases not requiring discretionary approval, as opposed to involving. And then your sections 1 through 6, who's in charge and what is the administrative review? When does it applicable and what criteria is it following? And it talks about the zoning administrators in here sometimes, and Planning Commission is the approving authority for a parking plan review. And yet it says down here that for cases not involving discretionary approval by a public body, the zoning administrator gets to approve it. So that needs some more work.
Want to address that, Zach?
Yeah, I appreciate the comment, and I think I could answer your question as, in terms of, you know, how we would apply this section, but we could take a closer look at it and maybe kind of try and clean that up and make it a little bit more clear about, you know, when this actually comes into play, when it doesn't come into play. So
And who's in charge of what? I mean, I understand that if you don't like what the zoning administrator says, you can come to Planning Commission, but yeah, I think it needs cleaned up. And I mean, that's part of what we're doing here. Some other sections of the code is cleaning up where you have problems. And I think this just invites a lot of problems for you.
Okay, well, I appreciate that observation. It's good to have the kind of the outsider's perspective on these sorts of things. So what I will say with this particular section, so we basically borrowed the structure of the landscape plan review section that was adopted earlier this year, and it follows a similar format in terms of, first it talks about discretionary reviews. So with discretionary reviews, I'll talk about landscape plan review first. So landscape plan review doesn't come into the picture for discretionary review at all. If you're going through a conditional use process, if you're going through a plan development or a subdivision process, then that basically is the process by which you can propose waivers from the code and be granted relief from the various standards. So landscape plan review, and by extension, what we're proposing now, parking plan review, wouldn't be applicable to those procedures. And then the section on administrative review is basically clarifying that under normal circumstances, absent a parking plan review process, the zoning administrator is in charge of enforcing and making interpretations when it comes to applying the code. But that the parking plan review, as I think you already understand, you know, that would come into play where you know, maybe there is a hang up between the applicant and the zoning administrator in terms of how to properly apply the parking standards. And this review process is the alternate to that. It's sort of the safety valve where you can say, well, let's just let the Planning Commission decide. Let's put it to a vote and let's, you know, examine it with them. So, you know, we could certainly take a look at, you know, how this is structured to kind of try and parse that out a little bit more in terms of, when it could potentially apply and when it maybe doesn't apply. We could take a look at that.
I mean, if the primary practice is going to the administrative review first, it's just, that's what happens. That ought to be A.
Oh, okay.
And discretion should be B, but I think it should be explained a little bit more that this is, that B is an alternate process available, to the developer or something.
Okay.
It just sure wasn't clear reading through it to me as to what applied to what.
Yeah, we'll take another look at it and see if it can be structured in a manner that makes it a little more clear about when it applies and when it doesn't apply.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay.
All right. And that actually concludes all the topics for parking code review. Were there any other questions from anybody I could address?
Another thing I noticed in the code that I was just curious about how it's been going to implement it is the bicycle parking, which is on 43. Is that something that is still largely being implemented?
It is, yes. I think that most recently came into play with there was a building permit review for the new Elms Hotel Annex. And because that was providing underground parking, it triggered the parking requirements. And that's sort of, it's part of my checklist when I go through building permit review. I make sure that they, show on their site plan the location of the bike racks, and then give us a spec sheet showing what the bike racks are going to look like. And then also came into play with the Kettering Health Center building permit as well. So yes, that is something that we utilize fairly frequently.
That's awesome. And the only, I only mention it because I think sometimes, and I don't know how this could ever be intuitively done, but I think a lot of times it's hard for some people to find the bike parking or to know that it's there. And it seems like a lot to change the code to make it, to require signage or some kind of indication as to where it is, especially given that it says there needs to be close proximity to entrances and this kind of thing. But I'm delighted to hear that this is being implemented because sometimes I hear from people that they want to bike uptown and they feel like there's not a lot of good places to park their bikes. So I know that we have a lot of competing interests for space uptown, but I think it's great that we're continuing to work on that. So thank you.
I have a question for Ben. You ready? Okay. So what I'm thinking about is that a lot of these things, we go to extraordinary lengths to identify the code and what should be done. And then we could have a Board of Zoning Appeals that just throws it all out. So my question is, and I have to ask it in public. So the question is a Board of Zoning Appeals required by state law, or is it something that the city has as an option whether or not to have a Board of Zoning Appeals?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. That's a great question. So I don't want to give the incorrect response to this, but my impression of this would be that certainly all the municipalities or cities that I'm familiar with do have a Board of Zoning Appeals, first of all. And I believe that's part of the required administrative review process for zoning issues that in order to allow, obviously, an applicant to have that additional layer of review regarding the zoning decision that's made. So that's my understanding that is required under state law, and it's a property rights type of issue. It's a due process type of issue. Certainly there is some flexibility in there with whether a Board of Zoning Appeals decision can be appealed further to a city council. I know that's different than the question that you asked, but certainly some municipalities have built into their code and it's basically an additional layer of review or additional protections for the property owner to give them another, I guess, bite at the apple, if you will, to have a city council look at a Board of Zoning Appeals decision prior to it being appealed to the Court of Common Pleas as a 2506 appeal. So I'm happy to look into that further for you, but my gut on that is that is something that's built into state law rights, constitutional rights under state law for property owners to get that additional layer of administrative review by a Board of Zoning Appeals.
I'd appreciate you looking into it. And, you know, there's not that many appeals that come up, but I wonder whether the Planning Commission could just do that. My problem is that it's unappealable, and the Board of Zoning Appeals, depending on the members that you get, and sometimes we have a good BZA and sometimes we don't. And sometimes they just approve anything that anybody wants. And so now we're spinning our wheels doing all this work when this other board has superior authority over everybody who's elected or appointed by council. And it continues to bother me. So I'd appreciate looking into it. Richard?
Isn't it in our charter, Bill?
Well, that's what I wanted to find out.
I'm pretty sure it's in our charter.
If it's in the charter, it's something that can be taken out of the charter.
That's true.
In 8 years, when Dick and I go back on the Charter Review Commission.
Yeah.
I do have.
And sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Ben.
Corey, go ahead.
I'll defer to Ben. I just wanted to go back to piggyback something Carla said, so please continue with this.
Okay.
I would just say, I just wanted to second what Mr. Keebler said. It is, the BZA is in the charter for the city of Oxford, as I understand it. So Mr. Keebler is correct on that point. Mr. Chair, I am happy to look into what requirements there are under state law concerning the existence of a Board of Zoning Appeals.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, now Corey.
So I actually want to reinforce and maybe go one step further than Carla shared about the bikes. As I've read through this and looked at what you proposed with the reduction of spaces, and I agree, 246 is a lot easier than round up, carry the 5, so on and so forth. Could we adjust the ratio? If I read correctly, and I've lost my spot because I went away from that. It was for every 10 parking spots, there was the 1 bike spot. If you and Sam could play with the math on that, if we're going to start to encourage and require less spots for parking, that's inherently going to provide less bike. And I think especially with all the efforts and the Oats Trail and bike lanes and all this stuff, I think having a mathematical formula that encourages / requires more bike would actually be more copacetic. I have no preconceived notion, but if it's at 1 to 10, even changing it 1 to 9, 1 to 8 would reinforce some of the other initiatives and be a little more comprehensive to other things going on in town.
Thank you. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, Corey, if I could just ask you, what would encouraging be? That is, how would you specifically and concretely define that? And Carla can answer this, but you were just speaking and you used that, and I'm thinking to myself, well, what exactly does encouragement boil down to in terms of actual steps and what people could do and what might do and what will do?
No, that's a good question. And Carla, feel free, you are far more knowledgeable on this, but when I read bike and motorcycle parking, it says spaces required. So this is page 43, 5A, 1A. It says, unless otherwise stated, at least 3 bicycle parking spaces or 1 bicycle space per 10 on-site vehicle. And then it goes after 50 and it has a different formula. All I was saying is if we're gonna require less parking spots from 2.5 to 2, then that inherently slides the ruler to less required bike spots. So I want to make it a more a better mathematical.
Bikes.
I see it now.
Yeah. I just don't want to see somebody abuse that to not have to put bike spaces in because, oh, I don't have to put car or bike. No, we actually want to encourage logical,
Okay,
complementary. So,
Sam?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to comment that based on what we're hearing, I think what we need to do is just do a kind of an overall filter on what the low-hanging fruit might be to improve the likelihood for someone to utilize a bicycle. I've got several ideas, not just the ratio. So I think we can bring something back that'll be a modernization that'll be amenable to everyone.
Amen.
thanks, Sam.
Steve, did you have another comment or? No. Anybody else? Okay, Zach.
Okay. I guess we'll move on to the next topic then. District and supplemental provisions update is what we're calling this one. And this affects 3 different chapters of our zoning code. 1141, which is our accessory, temporary, supplemental, and environmental regulations chapter. 1143, which is our districts chapter that just goes through each district one by one and lists permitted uses and standards affecting each. And then there's one definition being added for a patio in chapter 1159 definitions. So beginning with our first topic, porches, stoops, and decks.
By the way, I had to have an explanation from Zach on what constitutes a stoop. So anyway, go ahead.
So what we want to do with this, so presently we have 2 different chapters that talk about porches, decks, and patios at least. 1141 addresses those, and then in 1143 in the mile square districts, it also lumps in the stoops. So what are we talking about here, and can we be consistent? So what we would like to do is make all of these sections, the mile square sections and the accessory chapter section, all address porches, stoops, and decks alone. Patios we would address separately, and that's a separate topic that I'll get to later. But basically what the code says already is that a deck that is, I think what it says is if it's over 50 square feet, it's prohibited from being in the front of the house. I think that's what it says. So we're basically taking a standard and we're kind of reincorporating it into the language to clarify that any deck that is 50 square feet or less is going to be considered a stoop. And any stoop would be allowed on any facade of a structure. It could be to the front, to the side, to the rear. It doesn't matter. You can have the stoop wherever. But when it exceeds the 50 square feet, then it's just a deck. It's no longer a stoop deck. And that would be limited to the rear yards only, which is actually, it's already a current standard in the mile square districts. But we don't provide any exceptions for it. And we've run into challenges with this one where we've either had to interpret it in a different way, like interpret it as a porch instead of a deck to make it permitted, or folks have had to come in for a variance to this section. So what we would like to provide for is an exception to say any deck that is going to be on a corner lot where you don't have a rear yard, where you only have front and side yards. On those corner lots, you can have a deck in the side yard so long as it is set back at least 10 feet from the building's front facade. So it's not sticking out into sort of the front yard area of the street and being more of an intrusion into the street presence, that it's going to be set back just a little bit of ways from the front facade and kept more interior to the property. And the next slide will show you a couple of the examples that we've dealt with. So the example over here on the left, this was one, this was actually a deck that was built without a permit that had to come in for an after the fact permit. And then unfortunately we had to deny the permit because it wasn't in the rear of the property. But this particular property was a corner property. It didn't have a rear yard. So there was no way that they could comply with the code standard that we had. So ultimately they came forward for a variance from the BZA, which the BZA granted. But as you can see, and it's really not all that intrusive. It's set back fairly well from that front facade. It's not projecting out into the, front yard area and being kind of an odd, presence. It's well done in terms of its placement. So what this code provision, this suggested update would do is basically allow for a situation like this to happen in a by right manner where you don't need to come forward to the BZA for approval for a side yard deck situation. This image over here, this was a renovation of a student rental property in the Mile Square. And again, they wanted to put a deck off to the side, and this was a corner lot. And the way that we said that they could do it is they could either go forward for a variance, or they could turn it into a porch by adding a roof. And that's exactly what they chose to do. They added the roof element to this, and then that magically made it a porch, and all of a sudden it was okay to do it. So we hope that the amendments to this section will help kind of clear up, the allowance for and placement of porches, decks, and stoops. Any questions on this one? Yes.
I do. Can you discuss what went into the determination of 50 square feet as being the determinant? Because it seems to me the one on the left might even be 50 square feet. I mean, if it was 5 feet deep and 10 feet wide, then it's allowed anywhere, and you can still have a deck on the front of the house.
Yeah, the 50 square feet, the only reason it was kept at 50 was because the code presently says that stoops may not exceed 50 square feet. So it seemed like that was already a policy that the community at a previous time had put into place. But now that we've got, the code amendments open, I think that's certainly up for debate as far as maybe whether that's too large or we want to shrink that down a little bit more.
I still don't understand the concept of a stoop, but yeah, go ahead, Sam.
I was just going to say that there is a building code requirement for some egress doors to have a minimum 5x5 landing area. And then if you add steps to that, you get pretty close to the 40 or 50 square feet. I don't know if that's relevant, but there's a building code aspect on that.
Do the steps count as part of the 50 square feet?
I don't think we've ever discussed our interpretation on that, but I don't know. We'll have to look into it.
I think the code was developed to prevent people from just putting a deck out on front of their house. And it seems like we're saying, well, yeah, you can have a small deck on the front. There's nothing about materials or railings or anything else to define what the heck a stoop is. So that's my problem. I don't know if anybody else shares that problem or whether I'm the only one who does.
I do want to.
Go ahead, Steve.
Well, excuse me, I just simply want to reaffirm that I am struck similarly, and I studied it before, and I hear what Zach has said, but I would need further clarification to really have a 100% grasp of it.
Okay.
So
I may
maybe
be the only one who's worried about it.
what I might,
Every time you say stoop, all I can think of is Oklahoma's football coach. So I'm not distracted at all.
As a Cornhusker fan, I'm always distracted. All right. Go ahead, Zach.
yeah, so one way we might be able to address the concern is by crafting definitions for decks and stoops. That would be another way to go about it.
I would really appreciate that.
Yeah, instead of just trying to explain it in the language in the code provisions themselves, have a separate definition for each and then have separate standards for each.
My understanding of a stoop was always it was just something for your door to come out on before you go down the steps. And so it was usually a small thing. It wasn't where you could even put a chair there. It was just meant to get you out of the house before you went down a set of stairs.
See, and when I think of stoop, I think of brownstones in DC, Boston, New York, or for lack of a better description, because this is the day it first aired, is Sesame Street.
Which are about 5 by 5, 25 feet.
Yeah, but it's predominantly, if I understood it, was less than 25 feet. It's the actual complex of the whole stair.
Yep.
So
that's where my concern is, exactly. Because I think you need to have a stoop. I think it's a dumb word. You need to have a stoop in the side, wherever you have a door, you might need a stoop, right? Especially if it's above grade. So I think you need to define it, and then we can talk about dimensions. But it seems to me like, you know, if they're expanding it to 10 feet wide, then it's not a stoop anymore. That's my opinion. Okay. Thank you for working on that. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll take a closer look at that one and see if we can add a little bit more to this one.
I warned you I was going to be difficult about the stoop.
Bill, I have a question for Zach, and I apologize if I missed this, because, you know, I did look up stoop to Bill's point. I mean, really, it's just a giant staircase structure that, and I say giant, you know, to his point, 25 square foot. Do we have any in the traditional sense? I know there's a definition sense of square footage and height and things of that nature, but I can't think of any structures in town that we would all know of that we could say, oh, that's a stoop. And then also, if we don't have that, and much like in this presentation, we have the design standards on HAPC. Can our code include a picture example of, like as an appendix? Could we have something that like not only, I guess, verbally laid out certain parameters, dimensions, but then also could we do an appendix that would give visual examples?
I think that's a good idea. I think the Gaslight development does have stoops.
That's about the only thing I could think of, but I wasn't sure if that qualified.
Yes.
Yeah, we could add some images to the mile square sections of the code first. I think, you know, kind of what this is getting at here is that I think the common stoop would be something that resembles a deck that's using wood material that is going to be painted and have steps down, and it's basically a miniature version of a deck. But you guys are right to point out that there are other, you know, stoop designs out there that are much further from that, you know, sort of description or resemblance to sort of a traditional or conventional deck.
I think of a stoop as being concrete. So.
Yeah, and I don't think that's the intent for this section to be, you know, interpreted in that manner. I think it's as it's written right now, it's really only interpreted to apply to, you know, sort of those wooden structures, primarily wooden structures that are resembling decks. So yeah, so we can, like I said, we can kind of beef up this section and add a little bit more clarity to what exactly we're talking about.
Thank you.
All right, good discussion. Fences and walls are next. So there's really only just one sort of minor change to this section. Currently, well, with fences, number one, we don't have any setback provisions for them except from the front lot line. So, you know, as it would make sense, you can put a fence right down your property line. There's no reason to have a setback requirement for the sides and the rear. But then for fences in the front yards, which have a maximum height of 4 feet, and we want to leave it as such, we're not proposing a change to that. But what we are proposing a change to is instead of taking the 2 feet off of the front yard lot line, which where that line actually falls can vary. site by site in town in terms of whether it actually coincides with the back of the sidewalk or is a little further away from the back of the sidewalk. We would rather, just for consistency's sake, not talk about the front line at all, and just use the back of the sidewalk as a suitable proxy out in the field to say any front yard fence that's going to be built has to be built 2 feet back from the back of the sidewalk. That way, the fencing contractor that goes out there knows exactly where the fence has got to go. It's still going to be on the private property and not in the right of way. And this will help tremendously with administration of this particular section, because then you don't have to require a survey or have your property staked to know exactly where you need to put your fence. Yes.
I have no disagreement, but I was curious, is the 2 feet just to keep it similar to the 2 foot, or is there something I'm missing? Like, could it be 1 foot? Is there a benefit to 2 foot? I'm just thinking, and I know BZA or other folks can address, an awkward size side yard or something of that nature, but I was just curious where the 2 foot distance came from.
Yeah, I don't really have any good answer to that other than it's just the current standard in the code.
Okay.
And I did find this example here in town of something that is actually pretty pleasing and definitely, showcases kind of the intent of what these standards are all about. So you can see, the gap there between the sidewalk and the fence. So rather than putting it right up next to the sidewalk, a little bit of a gap there. That's probably the best explanation I could give as far as what that 2 feet is accomplishing.
No, I was just curious because to me there's a lot of distance between the sidewalk and the fence, and I just didn't know if for utility or anything else there was another benefit that I wasn't thinking. Definitely not a deal breaker, more of a curiosity, because I would hate to see a ton of appeals come through because of a foot here and there. So no, it's good. I was just curious.
Any other questions on fences and walls here? Okay.
Okay, the next one, there is a potential loophole in our code that we wouldn't allow for this loophole to be followed. But again, we want to kind of protect against, any potential future misinterpretations of the code. So one of the things that was put into place in 2017 to accommodate the new accessory dwelling units in the R3MS district, they actually changed the restriction on principal buildings section. And they said that in a residential district, except for R3, R4, and R3MS, that was the added element to that section, there should be no more than one principal building or use on one lot. What this would open you up to, if it was read literally and interpreted literally, is that you could have more than one 3-family dwelling or more than one 2-family dwelling on one lot. You could have multiple principal buildings on one lot. And that defeats the purpose of what R3MS is all about and what its intent is. So what we propose is just to make sure it's absolutely clear that you wouldn't allow for a situation like that it would be one principal building or structure per lot, not more than one. It's just to simply take it out again, take out R3MS, and with the understanding that the accessory dwelling units, it's not going to really impact the interpretation of those, because those aren't principal uses and they aren't principal structures, they're accessory by definition. So I don't think that is going to have or present any conflict with those sections by removing this district. I think it will help us tremendously to get rid of this potential loophole that somebody could look to in the future in a way that we wouldn't want them to look to it.
So explain to me how that works in R3 and R4.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think I have some explanation of that in my memo. They have some protections in there in place to where if you go above a certain size site, it automatically triggers the plan development process. So there's ways in which somebody couldn't get absolutely carried away with the proposal and not have it go forward for more of a discretionary review that goes through the lens of planning and council. Let me see if I can find my.
I know Gaslight would be an example, but that's a PUD.
Yeah, that was a plan development, and that was I think that's an R2 MS underlying zone. As a matter of fact, I don't think we have too many areas of our city that are zoned R3 and R4 that are undeveloped. So there wouldn't be too many instances where those districts would come into play, at least for new development. Yeah, here's my section of the memo where I talk about it. So yeah, R3 and R4 have protections in place to ensure that sites 3 acres or larger are required to go through that plan development process when involving more than one principal building. So if there was an example of a site in town that was zoned either R3 or R4, and somebody wanted to do something similar to Gaslight, as you pointed out, then they would be required to do a plan development for a large scale development. And that helps kind of mitigate the potential for going above and beyond sort of the limitations of the code and doing something in an administrative manner to make sure that gets more heavily scrutinized and goes through more of a rigorous review when it's involving multiple buildings on a single lot.
So if it's a smaller lot, so it doesn't trigger a PUD and it's in R3 or R4, they can have multiple buildings.
Yes.
I just don't think that's smart.
Yeah, that's how the code is written. So if that's something
I would ask commissioners whether you think that's a reasonable thing to have in our code. Don't all speak at once. But.
Can you please, I put my hand up. Could you rephrase that and just give it the context once more so I can help you?
We think as a planning commission that it is reasonable in the R3 district or in the R4 district to have more than one principal building or use on a single lot.
I don't
Well,
see it.
the combination of, let Dick go. Go ahead, Dick.
I don't see it's a problem as long as it has to go through the PUD. If it's possible to occur without going through the PUD process, then I agree. I think we have a problem.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point, because if it's less acreage, then all of a sudden you can have more buildings without any review.
Right.
So that's really my concern, are lots that are too small to be a PUD. All of a sudden we're saying, yeah, well, go ahead and have more than one building on the lot. And it just doesn't make sense to me.
And in fact, the buildings don't have to be as big as R4 or R3. They could build 3 houses.
Yeah, on one lot.
On one lot in that district. That's wrong.
Yeah. Which I could see a triplex is not 3 buildings, it's 1 building.
Right.
Yeah.
Jason, help me out.
Yeah, I was just going to concur. It seems problematic, and I'm surprised it exists.
Yeah.
That's where I'm at.
I don't even know of any cases where that's there, but to the extent that somebody could tear down what's there and rebuild, they could do by right. They could put 2 buildings in an R3 if it's not not a full acre, I guess. 10, whatever the PUD kicks in, that's 10 acres, I believe. So would you check into that and get back to us and see if you think there's any need for any of the districts to allow more than one principal building or use on a lot.
Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to check that.
That would make this all a lot simpler.
All right, I'm glad that we shine the spotlight on this section because it potentially, yeah, it exposed another vulnerability potentially to having more than one principal building on a lot. So, all right. Next topic is the front yard setback and vacated right-of-way. So this is rewording the section in a way that I think helps make it a little bit more clear in terms of its application. This was something that when I first started here, I read the section and I didn't really know based on how it read, how to interpret it. It was oddly written. So basically what it says or what it communicates is that when you are measuring a setback in a case where there's these vacated right-of-way strips that they were vacated way back in 1853 when the then Village of Oxford decided to get rid of 33 feet of right-of-way on either side of the various streets within the mile square and basically give it back to the property owner, the adjoining owners, but then restrict the uses of it. So not allowing for buildings within that area, but just allowing for, there's a couple things that it mentions that are allowed to be in there. But regardless, in terms of how to measure your front yard setback for these lots, the idea is that you're measuring it from the actual right-of-way line and not from the new vacated right-of-way line that was created as a part of getting or establishing these strips of land. So the way that I have rewritten this is to basically say that the vacated right-of-way does not contribute to the right-of-way from which you are taking the front yard setback measurement. So again, it's not changing the policy. It's not changing how we actually apply front yard setback standards in our mile square districts. It's just rewording it in a way that I think makes it more clear in terms of measuring it from this this inside line that's inside the vacated line and then the rest of the right of way, rather than the outside line, which actually borders the private properties themselves.
Could you just clarify what inside and outside means?
Yeah, so inside would be, if you can see my cursor.
Yeah, that would be the outside line, I would have thought.
I guess I see it as the inside line.
It's outside from the property.
I agree with Bill. I saw him that
Let me
way.
look back to the exact code language that I have proposed, because I don't think I use those terms in the actual code
Good.
language. That was just my way of trying to have it make sense.
So now just tell me, so where are we measuring to? Are we doing it to the one on the left or the one on the right? In
The one on
where
the
you
left.
have the cursor.
The one on the left.
Okay.
Yeah, and the exact language that I'm proposing now is to say the front yard setback shall be taken from the right-of-way line, and for purposes of applying this provision, any area vacated by ordinance number 103, which is the 1853 ordinance, measuring 16.5 feet in width, shall not be counted toward the right-of-way from which the measurement is taken. I think that makes it more clear that, oh, I shouldn't be using the vacated right-of-way to measure from the right-of-way line.
Thank you.
All right. Patios, I did say I was going to address this as a separate topic. So presently, patios are subject to the same setback standards that decks and porches and even structures are subject to. And we feel that we need to relax these standards a bit because it can become quite restrictive. And I've got an example here on this slide where it actually did ultimately change what the property owner wanted to do or ended up doing. So this was a property owner in Longmeadow, and they wanted to put in a deck that was in a fairly, reasonable location and not too close to their rear property line. But because they had a 40-foot rear yard setback, and because the deck had to comply with that setback standard, it became pretty restrictive. And so one way that we've been able to accommodate proposals such as these is we say, well, if you lower it down to ground level, then we'll allow it to happen. We'll say that it's acceptable because a patio doesn't have as much of a presence or impact upon adjoining properties as, say, a deck would, as being more of a structure versus something that's level with the ground. So what we propose is to have separate setback standards for patios that are different from those affecting decks or porches or structures. So we'd like to set it at 5 feet for side lot lines and 15 feet from the rear lot lines. So what this would do is basically codify a current practice of allowing for patios to be okay with or be found to be acceptable in terms of meeting the setback requirements, and allowing for a situation such as this to not require a variance. Any questions on this one?
I think we're good.
Okay. Residential building additions. So this is an interesting one.
I know that place.
So the section that we have right now, there's a number of different things going on with this one, and I'm actually going to pull it up on my screen so I can refer to it as I talk about it. The first point to make is that, well, as what's shown in the image here, we want to avoid a situation where somebody calls this an addition rather than a separate building.
Which it is.
Which, yeah, right now we want to basically take this situation here and insert new language into the code that says this would not be found to be an addition. This would be found to be a separate structure, and a separate principal structure at that. So what we've proposed here is to have language that says that all additions shall be connected to the original building by walls, floor, and roof that is completely enclosed from the weather. A roof, floor, or deck by itself would not be acceptable to meet that standard. So that will help kind of cut back on the potential for situations such as this to arise, where it's a way of getting around the zoning code by simply attaching two buildings together with a breezeway and then calling it one structure.
Zach,
Lots of hands.
all they're doing at this point though is, okay, put some windows on each side. It's a 4-foot walkway that's got windows on each side. Is that really accomplishing anything? It should have to be a room. You know what I mean? I'm not sure that what you're proposing puts enough heft in the plan to make it work.
Steve.
I want to, I don't know if congratulate is the word, but I'm very pleased to see this addition because I think it's right in its own way, and it addresses an issue that I live with, because I can shoot a stone from where that is to where I live.
Yep.
And so I've always been bothered by that, is what I'm saying. So I think it's a worthy addition. I congratulate, because I think it achieves an architectural advantage, which is worth noting. So thank you.
So looking at facial expressions and nods or lack thereof, I think that the commission is in agreement with your idea. And I think the Keebler's point is we got to be careful how we do it so they don't just, I mean, if they put screens in there, then it's a porch in between. Don't think that should be allowed either. So, Sam?
I just wanted to chime in here to say that this is something we're trying to put back to how it was in 2017. This was taken out to better encourage redevelopment in the mile square and take away obstacles. So we're trying to bring it a little bit back to what it was, maybe not quite as strict, but somewhere in the middle. So we'll do some more work on it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And the other key thing that's happening with this section, apart from the enclosing of the additions, so the language in here, it kind of lumps all the additions together into one section. So it doesn't matter whether that addition is resulting in a new dwelling unit or not. All additions are treated the same. And so what we would like to do is actually separate the standards based on whether the addition is actually resulting in a new dwelling unit or not. And then if it is resulting in a new unit, then there would be more intense requirements that come into play for those projects versus those where somebody is just adding an additional bedroom or a sunroom or something to that effect. So we've got instead, subsection 1, subsection 2, and for an addition that results in one or more units, then that addition has to be material that is similar in type and proportions to the original building. And if it is an addition that does not change the number of units, then the similar material provision applies only when it's visible from the right-of-way. So if you've got a sunroom addition that's in the rear yard that's not visible from the street, we don't care at that point what materials it's going to be utilizing. And this was something we've run into in the past where folks have actually had to come forward for a variance to this section. It's so specific. It says, if you've got a brick ranch and you want to put a sunroom addition and you want to use fiber cement, then it doesn't meet the code, and you need a variance. So we'd like to loosen up the code for those types of additions while still having that standard in place for, if you're going to be taking a single family dwelling and converting it to a duplex, then at that point, both of those units, they have to be similar to one another in terms of their materials and styling, and not be, sort of mismatch between the two. So.
Plus, this is an example of a deck on the front of the building.
Oh, yes, it is.
I believe that's an oversized stoop.
Yes.
And therein lies the issue. Because it is not a stoop, it's a damn deck.
Yeah. The students there call it the treehouse.
Yeah. I had, some of my students once lived in the treehouse. It was a mess. Okay.
All right, moving on.
All right. The next topic is a big one and it affects pretty much every zoning district in our code. And that is to establish a minimum lot frontage standard across all of our zoning districts. Presently, we have no lot frontage standards in the code whatsoever. We have lot width standards and we have lot area standards, but we don't have frontage standards. So what that means is there's not a straightforward way for staff when we get a lot split proposal from somebody who wants to split off a lot. If that lot that they're splitting off has no frontage on a public right-of-way, there's not a way for us to say we won't allow it without having a lot frontage standard, which I would say probably 99% of the zoning codes, at least that I've seen, all have such standards. So it's odd that we don't have these standards. There might have been instances in the past where maybe we thought we had them, or we interpreted the lot width the same as the frontage and just applied it in that manner. But, you know, if you read the code literally, we actually have no frontage standards. We have a definition for frontage in 1159, but there's really no use of it in the district's chapter. So we'd like to add frontage standards and basically just copy the same numerical lot width standards per each district, copy those over and call them the frontage standards as well. So the only difference there is that the lot width is measured at the front yard setback line, whereas the frontage is measured in line with the right of way. We would exempt cul-de-sac lots because those are a wedge shape. So they're going to have less frontage along the curvature of the cul-de-sac than they would when you measure it out to the front yard setback, whether it's, you know, 20 or 25 feet or whatever it may be. So you have to meet that lot width, but not the frontage.
It gets rid of flag lots.
Yeah, it would address the flag lot situation as well, because we don't have any way of regulating, you know, the connection of the parcel to a legal right of way. The only place where we might be able to say something about the flag lots is if it meets the lot width standard, but usually the lot width isn't a whole lot to where, especially, you know, if you're talking about a fairly sizable chunk of property, it may not be enough to really, you know, prevent that sort of situation from arising.
Corey.
So Bill and I were on the same with that, with the flag lots. And then for the cul-de-sac, I know those would be exempt, but isn't there part of the code that prevents the flag lot so that in a cul-de-sac, we couldn't have stacked, you know, like a wedge and then a line to something behind? That's still covered there. So that exemption wouldn't be a problem, right?
Well, I guess it depends on what we're talking about. If we're talking about doing like flag lots off of a cul-de-sac.
Because over by my house, there's two cul-de-sacs, and the ones that border Emerald Woods, the back part of them, you could actually, well, funny enough, we have a flag lot wedged between us and the cul-de-sac, where the driveway is nothing more than a driveway that parallels the lot line of a house on the cul-de-sac that opens up to a giant property in the woods.
The A-frame.
Yep.
I've been in that house. I know that house.
And again, it works in that area because of the space, but I could see where folks would carve out a trapezoid, if you would, for lack of a better, and basically stack two lots on it with a flag to the back one.
Well, and there are a couple of those around the community. I can think of one on Contreras. I can think of one that's outside the city limits, but on Bonham Road, that actually led to an enormous amount of resident conflict between the two, because somebody built the house right behind somebody else's house. So I think this is a wise move to put in a frontage requirement.
I just want to make sure the exemption on the cul-de-sac doesn't, well, they're going to be very few and far between, but I think maybe some language to clarify, you know, flag lots or whatever the legal design definition is. And I'm happy to, Sam knows where I live, so he can pull the map and show you what I mean about the property behind us. You'll see exactly what I'm talking about. It's a cul-de-sac access to a flag lot.
Is it the one on Stonehenge?
Yes.
Yep, I see it right here on the zoning map. So, okay, that gives me a good visual. So just to clarify, so having a lot frontage standard per se is not going to prevent every instance of a panhandle lot or flag lot. As long as they meet the frontage, well, in this case, it's on a cul-de-sac, so there'd be no frontage. So as long as they met that width requirement and the area requirement, we would have nothing else to say unless we had a separate standard that addressed flag lots or panhandle lots, you know, whether we address those solely on cul-de-sacs or whether we want to address them, period. There is a way to write a standard for that. that is actually separate from the frontage standards, where you basically say that the double stacking of lots is prohibited. And then we can put an image in there to show, exactly what we mean. And that would be kind of more of a subjective sort of application of the standard rather than a dimensional one, because how the flag lots and panhandle lot standards are typically handled is that it allows for a reduction in the normal frontage. So take, for example, if you have a normal minimum frontage of 100 feet on sort of a standard frontage lot, by allowing panhandle lots, you could say, as long as it's a panhandle and as long as it's double stacked, then we'll allow for the handle part of it to be down to either like 20 or 30 feet. And that's the way they define it. But if it's, the handle itself, if the handle is 100 feet and if it's, a humongous lot or, with a big flag part to it, then there's not a way to prohibit that from actually happening unless you have that separate standard that specifically talks about the double stacking of the lots.
Yeah, but if they meet the frontage, more power to them, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. I was thinking of the 20-foot driveway stick that goes a football field.
Yep. Sam, did you have a comment?
I was just going to say that we do have a single sentence prohibition in the subdivision code against flag lots. So we've got a little bit of subjectivity in there already.
I think that was there. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. And the next subject is the mile square design standards. And kind of to the point that Sam made earlier about restoring some of our prior provisions, this is another restoration of a provision we used to have that kind of got reduced over time, and now we want to basically put it back. So we want to have a section in here that talks about foundations that are greater than 2 feet in height, requiring them to be parged. And that kind of gets rid of this sort of unpleasant looking, block concrete foundation appearance and covers it over with a mortar or some other material, stucco or something that kind of blends it in and gives it sort of a smoother textured appearance. So that's something that we'd like to do to put back in place. We have also a section that talks about windows being required to be proportionally vertical instead of being horizontal. And oftentimes we run into instances where it's hard to meet that, where you've got like a kitchen with a window above the kitchen sink, and the window ends up being basically a square, or it's very hard to do sort of a vertical orientation to those windows. So we want to allow for exceptions to that based on certain instances, basement windows, kitchen windows, and so forth. So we would require vertical windows only when practical within our mile square design guidelines.
Why do we even do that? Because like picture windows are not vertical, they're horizontal. And people's, a standard living room picture window might be more horizontal than vertical. I don't know why that's an issue.
Bill, this is mile square standard, so there is a historical context to it. Horizontal windows, I can't think of anything. Yeah, it's mile square specific.
All right.
And then the last little change in here was just to delete a reference to the sign code. There's not any specific signage regulations within the mile square districts. It simply says, refer to the signage chapter for anything relating to signs, but doesn't provide anything additional. So we don't feel it's really needed, and we can just strike it out.
You would do that anyway. Richard?
Exactly.
Mile square design standards. What's the definition of a vertical window? I mean, a double hung window is vertical. Rectangular vertical window. What's the definition?
We don't have a definition, but we would interpret a double hung window as being vertical as long as the sides are taller than it is wide. Then that's the way that I've interpreted that standard.
I guess only when practical, I don't quite understand. There's some other areas in here starting on page 76 and repeated for the different ones. The use of artificial aluminum or vinyl siding within the mile square is strongly discouraged. And then you took out the sentence about vinyl siding. Where's the meat in that? Strongly discouraged is fine, but they can still do it.
Zach,
Right? Huh? Is that what we want?
Zach,
Yeah, so the way that that section is left right now is that we're just sort of cleaning it up, and we're not, at least right now, we're not proposing to, prohibit vinyl siding. At this point, all it does is it says it's strongly discouraged. So there's not a way for us to, at the building permit stage, to be able to say, if somebody wants to do vinyl, I don't have the ability to come back and say, well, you need to revise it and make it either brick or fiber cement or some other material. The only things we've done with this section, at least up to this point, is to remove the term artificial when describing aluminum. So we would just simply say use of aluminum and vinyl is discouraged. And then it says vinyl siding can be acceptable only when it meets the requirements of ASTM D3679. Well, those are requirements that all vinyl siding has to meet in terms of its manufacturing specs. So it's not something that we need. We just want to get rid of it. So it's just kind of cleaning up what's already there. But again, since we have the book open, we're kind of discussing these things. If we think it's something that, we might want to make a change to, the time and the place to talk about it.
In H, you got rid of a lot of language there about how it should be matching the current structure. How is that wise to remove all that?
Yeah, the reason we're kind of removing that is we don't want there to be any inconsistencies between these sections or these mile square districts and the previous section that we talked about residential building additions, which requires the similar materials and so forth, similar architectural style. So rather than having these two kind of competing sections that have slightly different terminology and are talking about the same thing, we would rather just completely strike this one and then just refer back to that.
You can refer back to the other one.
just in a different place.
Okay.
Corey, you had your hand up.
I was just going to offer a little perspective. HAPC has been working on some of these things that Zach just described with the mile square and some of the design standards and gosh, if you think of paint and vinyl and things of that nature, we're working on that in HAPC. So I don't know the legality of if it needs to be in here or if it needs to be there, but we're working on design standards that address it. And there's been a lot of study. Part of the reason vinyl is not as big of an issue is we're looking for the aesthetic outcome, not what the product is made out of. There's been a lot of improvements in vinyl that actually make it a better product. For the mile square, because back in the day there was limited product and scope and things of that nature, and some of these vinyls are actually replicating the original wood panel better than wood panel. So, and Sam, please jump in if I missed anything.
The only thing I was going to add, if it's okay, Mr. Chair, is that we're trying to be consistent with repairs that don't require building permit. So it's a little bit disingenuous for us to see somebody that's replaced all the siding on a building over a weekend and then require someone else or prohibit that same vinyl siding because of part of a building project that did require a building permit. So it's more of an administrative and enforcement nightmare for us. If we want to have a local building code amendment that requires a building permit for any siding replacement, we can talk about that, but that's what we need to get to. And I'm not sure we're ready for that as a, with a city our size and staffing that we have.
Okay. Moving on, Zach.
All right. I think this is the last one. Other code cleanup, including just adding the word maximum to our lot coverage standards. Again, that's current practice, but it doesn't actually come right out and say that this is a maximum. So we'd like to add that in. And then in each district where it talks about a bed and breakfast, this was something that we decided to not touch it with the Airbnb and like short-term rental regulations that recently got adopted. We didn't adjust for the variation in the terminology just for the sake of leaving it alone and not having it necessitate additional ordinances to change. But since we're reopening the code again with these text amendments, we might as well go back in and kind of clean that up. So each time there's a mention of a bed and breakfast, we would use it, capitalize the B in each word, use the and symbol, and then that directly corresponds to the new definition that we adopted earlier this year for our short-term rentals. So that's just cleanup. Again, that's not really changing any policies or, where bed and breakfast may be a conditional use versus not being a permitted use. It's just changing the terms that already appear in the code. And I think that is everything. I think that concludes the second package. So any other questions on anything else?
Anybody have questions? Okay. Well, I think we had a good review there. Thanks, Zach. Appreciate it. So we've given you a couple things to work on, but maybe at our next meeting, then we'll see the results of all that. Okay. If there is nothing else, then we can move to just the observation that there were 2 administrative approvals. If anybody has any questions on those? If not, I would entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting.
I so move.
Wait, Ben?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a really quick note, quick but important. I did want to circle back to an issue that was raised by Mr. Watt earlier regarding abstention voting. I'll be very quick about it, but this is important. I want to thank Mr. Watt, Corey, myself, and Sam had a very valuable conversation the other week about the permissibility of abstention voting. And I want to note that abstention voting is permissible. So Corey's correct. Abstention voting is permissible under Robert's rules, which the city of Oxford has adopted. So, to be clear about that, individuals are allowed to abstain from voting or cast an abstention vote. That's perfectly acceptable. And along the same lines, individuals are not required to actually cast a vote or explain why they are casting the vote that they're casting. Now, along those lines, and this is something that Corey and I discussed, there's, from a policy standpoint, we want to encourage people to obviously cast a vote either in the affirmative or the negative on particular issues, unless they have, I should say, we want to encourage people to actually affirmatively vote one way or the other when possible. So, obviously everybody here does a great job. Everybody's very active. Everybody has a lot of expertise and perspective that they bring to matters. So when possible, we of course want to encourage people to cast a vote one way or the other. But certainly abstention voting is acceptable. I'm happy to answer any questions about that, but I do want people to, I want to correct our previous position and thank Mr. Watt again for having this really constructive conversation with me about the ability to cast an abstention vote. I'm happy to answer any questions if there are questions.
I'm glad you brought it up because when Chris talked to council, he specifically said that there should be no abstentions. There could be recusals, but not an abstention. So this is a different interpretation.
It is, and I've spoken to Chris about it, and I do want to, Mr. Chair, that's a really great point. So there is of course a distinction between recusals and abstentions, and I want to be clear about that. And I know, Mr. Snavely, you certainly know this, and I'm sure the rest of the the members know as well. But certainly if you have a conflict of interest, either real or perceived on a matter, you should advise that you're recusing yourself, and that's taking yourself out of the vote because of that potential conflict of interest and abstention. Obviously, Corey exercised an abstention earlier on tonight. Very good reason for doing so. He couldn't either affirm or discount the minutes because he was not a part of the last planning commission.
Absolutely.
So certainly abstentions are good in the proper circumstances. We do want to encourage them, as I said, to be rare. We want people to participate, and that just benefits everybody to have more voices affirmatively voting one way or the other. But certainly for those who want to abstain, they have a reason for doing so. It doesn't necessarily have to be good. We want to allow them to do that, when they feel it's appropriate. And I thank Mr. Watt again. We really had a really nice conversation, and I thank Mr. Watt for bringing that to our attention.
I needed that little bit of humor. Thank you. Okay. With that said, we'll go back and see if we can get a motion to adjourn.
I so move.
It's moved by Mr. Dana and seconded by Mr. Bracken. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor of adjourning, raise your hand. It is unanimously passed. Good evening. Have a safe month, and we'll see you in December.